everybody. Thank you for joining me. I'm Dan, and this is the Having Initiative podcast. This is the first episode of season 2. It's been a while since I recorded a full episode, and so I'm really happy to be back. And I thank you all for joining me thus far. And so this episode is called We Live in a Society. So society is a word that's thrown around a lot these days, at least on my end. I hear people say that society tells us that this is the desirable body type, or they chalk it up to societal standards, the pressure to have that figure. I also hear that society tells us that we have to be grinding constantly or we're not being productive and a waste to others. Or like with gender roles, society tells us that men need to be this or women need to be or should be that. And society tells us that this demographic of people and so forth and so on. So since the word is thrown around a lot and used in different contexts, and some of those ideas that I mentioned, I do kind of feel that in my life. But when I ask people, what exactly is this society that is doing it, they can't quite narrow it down, because with every idea that they hear that they should do, they hear a bunch of people that reject it or don't care about that. And one of the things, like when I ask them to define what this society is, they say, well, it's not like a necessarily particular place, but you hear that idea being thrown around everywhere. You see it everywhere, that kind of thing. And remember what I said in season 1 about the possibility of interpretation versus projection. So there are some slightly better definitions of what society, quote unquote, is, such as mainstream news or entertainment, like relating to music or movies, that kind of thing, or sports. A lot of ideas seem to be generated in like pop culture. And so that's what they mean by you see it everywhere. And also like advertising for clothing, that kind of thing. So oddly enough, the people that argue against that society is giving bad ideas or unrealistic expectations to live up to, that kind of thing, a lot of them will still listen to that music or watch those movies or take part in some sort of social, it's not social structure, but a cultural idea that goes around. And a lot of that is going to be what the thrust of this podcast is going to be about. So when people are arguing for societal change or political change and arguing about how they know what we should do, a lot of times they are arguing for the betterment of society, that society needs to improve or that they can do it. So what is it? It's not so easily defined. If you can't define it, then how are you going to change it? And I'm not saying that those phenomena that I talked about, how society says this, society says that, those things don't exist. But at times, a lot of those things are kind of written off and blamed on quote unquote society that, again, they can't define a little too easily. And they want things to change, but since if you're writing it off like that, you're not going to truly understand what is going on and what needs to be done for that kind of change. And a little example of this is like when I was in high school or so, that high school was it was next to a bunch of shopping centers and stuff, but it was, a self-enclosed environment, and it was almost like its own little society. And there were ideas floating around about people like she's the popular one or he's the jerk, that kind of thing. But and everyone could tell you these ideas, but a lot of the time when I ask people, like, what do you really think? They didn't have any evidence for that, or they didn't actually believe those ideas floating around. That's kind of just what they heard from everywhere. And so I was wondering if this was a small sample size, if seemingly everyone knows these things because they hear it from everyone else, but nobody actually believes it, then how are these ideas getting passed around? Or why are these ideas getting passed around? Why are people sharing it? And so all of what I just said is kind of just setting the scene for what I'm going to be talking about. So the kind of three main categories that this topic is going to cover are about with society: scope, homogeneity, and moral claims. So here we go. Okay, talking about the scope of society. I mentioned, I believe, in the last episode of season one, Self Reliance, about organizational structure of atoms into molecules, into organelles, into a cell, and although you get all the way up to an organism. And an organism, seemingly one singular entity, is made up of a lot of smaller things going on. And society kind of mirrors that. And so when I talk about scope, I'm going to be talking more specifically about this pattern right here. A bunch of individuals together can be, a group, or if you're living a bunch of houses together, that's a neighborhood. A bunch of neighborhoods can form a town. A city is kind of, I don't know the exact difference between them, but a much larger town for all intents and purposes. There's probably other criteria. A bunch of cities can potentially reside in a county. A bunch of counties can make up a state. I'm in the US. And there's a bunch of states in the nation. And if it's not states, then think provinces or something like that. And a bunch of nations in a close area can be a region of sorts. And several regions can be inside of a continent. And then several continents are inside of Earth. So, again, the emergent structure, when I talk about society, which I'm going to go into these various levels. So, a neighborhood, there's a bunch of people living there, and they live in their separate houses or apartments, or it could be in a neighborhood, could be an apartment complex, or it could be the various buildings around that apartment complex that everyone interacts with on a regular basis. And an example of this is like in New York, the Bronx is notorious for having its own cultural identity, and how people are kind of all thrust together and they share those common features, or they're aware of them and they abide by certain cultural conventions. And I've heard people say that with not just the Bronx, but in certain areas of New York, it's not what it used to be. And some people attribute that to change, but others attribute it to other people who weren't born and raised in that environment moved in there, and they brought something different with them, or they just didn't go along with a certain threshold of that culture that existed beforehand. There's that expression, well, there goes the neighborhood. It's when someone else outside of that neighborhood comes in that doesn't maintain the status quo. And there's a lot of talk about, breaking the status quo is the highest ideal that we should go to. But in the cases of neighborhoods, most of the time, people did reach these common shared values, or I guess agreements about how people should conduct themselves. And then somebody who didn't contribute to the construction of this neighborhood or its stability comes in and decides to change everything. So I don't attribute change the status quo as a default as a inherent good. Now there could be definite times where that's a good thing. So don't get me wrong about that. And with a neighborhood, in terms of having an identity, there can be like spoken rules or kind of enforced in some way, like a homeowners association, or unspoken rules about interactions that are those more cultural things that, again, aren't in law and may or may not be enforced to some extent on the ground, but they are there. So we talked about a neighborhood, a town, like, a couple of neighborhoods together, a much bigger place. That can have an identity too. Like, I don't know if Abilene in Texas is considered a city or not, but there's a lot of smaller towns that, like Abilene has, I think it's Keep Abilene Boring, in contrast to Austin's Keep Austin Weird. But there's a lot, Abilene has its own identity like that. And then there's other smaller towns that do have their own identity. And so outside of those people that you immediately reside around, like in a neighborhood, there is a greater collective. You're not going to know everyone as well because there's just too many people and it's a bigger location and your life is still only 24 hours in a day. But there is that greater collective and commonality in that town that kind of binds you together. And different sides of towns can have very different cultures. And I was in a Texas city and I was at a wedding, and the comedian slash singer that was hired for the wedding was doing a riff on the okay, this is how people on the north side behave, and this is what the east side is like, and this is the south side is even worse, or stuff like that. And so, while a town, it is a singular entity that's made up of smaller ones, and each of those smaller entities can have their own identity, but also at the same time have commonality with the others. So they're the same and they're different. So let's skip cities and jump up to the state level. I'm talking about Texas right now. Houston, Austin, San Antonio, Dallas, Fort Worth, those are the big city areas. And each of them are pretty different from each other. They have things in common, of course, because they're all in the same state, but they have very different identities. Like I mentioned before, keep Austin weird. A lot of people say very nice things about it, but there's also some interesting stuff going on there. Let's put it that way. And then San Antonio, military city, so there's that influence, and also it's Austin, Houston, Dallas. Yeah, it has a Spanish name, and that there's a big cultural influence there. And then Houston, like geographically, you're closer to the coast than any of those, and you're also starting to get closer to Louisiana. The topography is different from the others. And so these cities, they're in the same state, and they're all, that kind of Texas identity is with them all, but they're very different from each other. And if we're talking about states have their own cultural identity. Now, I'm going to talk about Texas again for a while, sorry. Texas is big, and so it's hard to maintain a common identity, but there's always, like, you could list the qualities of what are, I guess, Texas qualities, if you will. And you could make a list, and not every area from the valley to the panhandle to the East Texas to West Texas, not every person is going to like embody every single one of those, but they're going to be aware of them. And a lot of people are going to, assuming you've been living there for a while, identify with parts of them. And so again, recapping everything that I've talked about, towns, neighborhoods, states, cities, they're all a smaller part of something big, but they don't all share that same level of that greater identity. And I'm going to tie this all together in just a moment. So let's start talking about nations. You can divide, I guess, regions of the world. Like one of the most common ones is East and West. The Western countries, generally speaking, will have more in common with each other than Eastern countries. That's part of the difference between them. But there's a lot of Western countries, and apply this to the East as well, that have seemingly little or nothing in common with each other. And so when we talk about the West or Western society, that applies there, is that they have a common overlap, but they can be very different, and all the way down to speaking different languages. So tying this all together, I've mentioned various levels of, town, city, and so forth. Each one of these you could consider to be a society, the smaller levels, and then the bigger part they're a part of, you could also consider that a society as well. And you can belong to the smaller ones and the larger ones, but even if you live in the smaller one, you may not fully identify with everything that's going on there, or you may not identify with the ideas of the larger body that you're a part of. So to bring it all together, if each of these levels are a part of something and they each have their own identity, then when people say society tells us this or that, exactly what society are you referring to? So I'm going to go into that a bit more. But I hope you see that as much as we are part of something bigger than us, and then that thing that's bigger than us is part of something bigger than it, where do these ideas come from and how much do you subscribe to it? And so how much do you really have to go along? Or, yeah, that kind of thing. Okay, that brings us to homogeneity. So I've talked about with the various scopes of society, and these are locations more so than ideas, although the locations have their own ideas. There's variability within each one of them. As I mentioned, there's common traits within various areas. An accent can be a big one. An example with the UK, it's made out of England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. But within each of these areas, there are multiple accents or dialects. I'm not quite sure what the official term is. There's these different accents, and the people that live in those areas and adjacent to other areas, are very much aware of the differences between these accents. But someone like a foreigner may not, I mean, they may sound all the same, or they can kind of recognize, yeah, they're a little different, but they can't articulate it that well. But people that live there will tell you exactly what area each accent is from, and almost get offended if you imply that they're all the same. So even within an area, a relatively geographically small area like England, for example, there's a lot of different accents. So when we're talking about homogeneity within society, in order for anything to exist, you need a certain level of structure. Regardless of how big or small it is, it needs a certain level of structure for stability. And a lot of people argue that, we can just coexist with common humanity. Some people can, but there's always a give and take, and that give and take, even if it's just unwritten, you're doing it out of your own survival, or if it's codified in some sort of structure or law, we need that just to coexist. And so most people ideally will argue with laws or regulations or something. These are created for a good cause. It's to prevent something bad from happening, or it's to just clarify rules, because if there's like property laws or something, there's hundreds of different ways that things could go on, and people are like, okay, well, if things go a certain way one day and things go a different way another, then what's the kind of standard that we should all look to? And so ideally law should be something that is fair and clarifies things for everybody. Now, outside of laws or any ruling body, there are rules that exist that aren't, in law, but they're there. And usually, just like laws, they came into being for some reason, and hopefully that reason is good. And for example, we talk a lot about, murder is bad or wrong, or violence is inherently awful, that kind of thing. Or say theft is wrong, although there are a lot of people these days that are contesting that notion. And so, murder is bad, theft is bad. There could be, cracks in the legal structure, but a lot of people will kind of gravitate towards those without the law and know that these things are inherently wrong, and that inherent wrongness is kind of an unwritten rule. And we take these for granted because if you look at the history of humanity, uh, you know, killing people that are different from you, or that violate certain seemingly unimportant rules, whether they be personal or societal, and then those people get butchered and mutilated in all kinds of ways. That's actually very common the further back you go in history, and it wasn't that long ago. So a lot of the rules, like just common rules about society, we are taking for granted. So a lot of what we view as quote unquote society telling us to do something is a structure in itself. and I'll elaborate on that in a moment. Really quick, really quickly, I want to talk about culture because a society has culture or can have multiple cultures inside of it. And a lot of people talk about, you know, culture is beautiful, and there's various ways that they do that because we are social creatures. We need to interact with others. Now, some people can get by with less interaction, and some really need a lot of it. But like COVID really highlighted this. Everywhere where people have been, quote unquote, locked down and having various lingering restrictions like that, there have been a rise in negative mental health metrics, particularly in the youth. And people try and attribute it to, anxiety about the virus or other things. But I mean, a lot of it, if you ask people, it can be attributed just to not being able to interact with others as much as they could before. Like school was disrupted, and so the standard, interactions with other children that's part of their development wasn't happening. It's not the same thing as doing it over a Zoom call. And like a lot of people could seek refuge in video games to occupy their time, but that's just a distraction if you're doing it for that, and that's not an ideal that for the situation. And interacting with others takes you out of yourself and into something bigger. And some people treat that as, the universal good that we should seek is always be doing something better than yourself. But there's nuance to that. But there is good to be had from it. So whether you're interacting with 5 people or you're a part of a group of 50 million, that thing that's bigger than you have to take on certain aspects of it. It takes on its own shape and structure. But if you're a part of it, if you want to be a part of it, you have to not just, I guess by agreeing with those things, you're being a part of it, but at the same time, you have to act them out in a certain way. And a lot of that structure of that thing that's bigger than you is the stuff that society asks of us. And I'm not necessarily talking about society tells us that this is the ideal body shape. A lot of the things that are asked of us are just being a good citizen, or don't litter, or hold the door open, or don't leave your trash lying around, because all of those things could bite you and it makes your life difficult and it makes everyone else's life is difficult. So we got to go along with certain things. And it's like, yes, you're free to do what you want, but at the same time, don't make waves or don't make too much of a hassle because that causes issues, that kind of thing. And some of those structures are real and some of it are just ideas that are floating around. And I think it was Carl Jung, but it might have been Sigmund Freud, who said, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And this is kind of the embodiment of that, about how ideas are around and people kind of give in to them in a way that they may or may not, or they should or shouldn't do. So let me elaborate on that. So when I talked about how society could be like an organism that's made out of organs, and organs are made out of organ tissues, and so on. A society is made out of people, ultimately, however big the groups are, the subgroups, but even the smallest group is made out of individuals. We aren't as rigid or monolithic as, to continue the metaphor, an atom is or a molecule is. And I'm not just talking about like on our physical construction layer, like with cells and whatnot. I'm talking about psychologically. And so a person is alive, and there's all kinds, we've probably all heard all different kinds of stories about how people are complicated and changing all the time, that kind of thing. But just as an individual is changing and can change and can go with the flow, can make smart decisions and can make stupid decisions, groups are made out of people. And so naturally, just as people are alive and constantly changing and adapting, groups are a living thing in a way, and they are constantly in flux. They're not static. And if they are in equilibrium, equilibrium doesn't mean a balanced equation of 2 plus 2 equals 4 all the time. That's much more complicated on both sides, and the variables are constantly in flux, and it's constantly balancing itself out for some kind of equilibrium. That's the whole thing. And part of living, whether it's an individual or a group, is adapting. And so with groups, here's something that I hope clarifies a lot of what I think, quote unquote, society telling us what to do is. So imagine there's 100 people in a group. The particulars don't matter. And we do a survey of them about what the best color is. Again, don't go into the details of clarifying what constitutes best. It's just what their answer is. Now, 30% of those 100 people, so 30 people, say that red is the best color. Now, let's say out of all the colors, that is the one that has the highest percentage. It's the majority or the plurality. I forget which one I apply here. So that's 70%, 70 people out of 100 that don't believe that red is the best color. But their individual answers for what the best color is, none of them total more than, individually, none of them total more than 30 or 30%. So if you look at a pie chart, you'll see a big, almost third of that pie chart that's red, and then the rest will be smaller little, pieces of pie that are different colors that in comparison don't stand out as much. Red will always look like the dominant color, but again, 30%, that's not that big, and it's not even half of the population. So a lot of, I believe, what society tells us in a big body of people are people who are aware of some idea that is being floated around that a large portion believes in or subscribes to, like with the red situation, that they think that is the ideal, or in the case of like my high school example about how everyone knew certain things because that's what they heard everywhere, but nobody actually believed it. So what society tells us is this idea and a big group of people that either agree with it or kind of propagate it without believing in it. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily the standard by any means. And of course, unlike molecules or atoms, the individual, the kind of smallest unit in a society, can be faced with those ideas about this is what you should do, that kind of thing, or it can get other feedback, and a person can take in all those things and examine them and say, that's stupid, I'm not doing it. So when we're talking about homogeneity, the individual can provide that homogeneity by subscribing to various aspects of it, but at the same time rejects the homogeneity by being an individual. So that brings us to moral claims. So with society and moral claims about it, a lot of people are arguing on behalf of society or the world, and they're saying, I will make a better society, or I'll make society better, or I will make a healthier society. Now, if we're talking about health specifically, we can objectively identify certain things that are associated with good health, but implementing them is tricky because people are numerous and varied, and with all kinds of health ideas, we've been wrong before. The food pyramid, that's the biggest example I can think of. And when we're arguing on behalf of society or the world, in my opinion, a lot of people who are doing that are on a power trip or have an axe to grind, but that's not as an attractive equality to admit to themselves or to others, so they kind of mask it under compassion. And I want to elaborate on that by talking about a guy named Stanislavski, who is a profound actor/acting teacher, I guess, who he came out with some would argue that he created this idea called method acting, but most of what is passed as method acting isn't actually what he was doing. But I digress. So he wrote a book called An Actor Prepares. And for actors, when you're doing a scene, you have to have a motivation, which is what your character is trying to do or wants to do. And even if you're just entering a room, what is your motivation for entering that room? Now, I mean, most the beginner students would say like, okay, well, my character is trying to get from point A to B, so that's what it is. His motivation is to get through the door, get into the room. It's not that hard. But the problem is that for I guess the book argues for real acting to occur, your motivation has to be big enough and it has to have meaning for your character. And so, when he was working with the students in this book on motivation, he would say, okay, start your motivation with I wish to, because again, it has to be something that they're trying to do. So I wish to dot 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 and what their motivation is. Now, a lot of them, again, we're doing the motivation like, okay, my character's motivation, I wish to enter the room. Okay, well, why? It's like, okay, I wish to enter the room so my character can do whatever they were doing. Now, the problem was is that those motivations weren't big enough, in his opinion. And so they started getting bigger and bigger, seemingly thinking that bigger was better. And eventually, one student said something along the lines of, okay, I wish to obtain power in order to bring happiness to all humanity. Now, that's big. That's a big motivation. And some would consider it admirable and something that a character could, get behind. But he said the problem with that motivation for your character work is that you can't truly believe in the possibility of it or its realization. And so, how does this tie to society? Well, a lot of people laying moral claims to society and improving it or fixing it, that kind of thing, they can't fully grasp all aspects of it and all people inside of it because people are so numerous and varied. And so that's my wariness with claims to an ideal society because I've examined things that I think are good ideas and I've thought, it would be great if everyone did this. But by trying to bring out those ideas or qualities or whatever, instilling that in myself or in others, something is lost. There is the opportunity cost of by doing that, you're not doing something else. And so people talk about diversity. So while there are things that we should be fundamental and strive for, the way that they come about perhaps need to be varied. And so trying to create an ideal society with certain tenets is a tricky notion at best. And so a lot of times when people are making moral claims to changing society or fixing it or improving it, they can get a bit too romantic, like that last actor that I talked about who wanted to, I wish to obtain power in order to bring happiness to all humanity. A bit romantic. And it's easy to identify problems or see the effect of them, but it's not easy to understand them. And I think a lot of people in general, not just people who are trying to change society, don't fully understand the problems. They're passionate, but that doesn't equate understanding necessarily. And fixing one individual, quote unquote, fixing one individual is hard. And this is outside of like major debilitating things like addiction. But fixing multiple people or fixing one person is hard. Now add more. And it gets that much harder. And so a lot of people can ID their problems in life, but they can't even figure out they get the source of it wrong. They may be projecting or something. Say they saw the symptoms, but they misdiagnosed the cause and therefore gave the wrong prescription. Now that's on the individual level. Again, apply that to more people. One person is complicated. Now add more. And so when people or you may find in yourself the drive to fix or improve society because you've seen suffering or you're empathetic, whatever your justification may be wary that you may be biting off more than you can chew, and you may cause more problems than you could potentially fix. So in terms of moral claims with society, a common one, this ties way back to the beginning when we're talking about body image and certain rules that may or may not be stupid, or conventions that are also like that. Now, when we're talking about body image specifically, these are kind of my ideas, but I think, I know as humans, we are biologically hardwired to survive. And a lot of what we take as, not just, that's people being people, are, you know, instincts that are coded into us, for a lack of a better explanation. So a lot of what body image standards are emergent properties that tie into that, like attractive qualities. Most evolutionary scientists can tell you some sort of advantage within nature or within mate selection that those features suggest, and that's why we hold them up. It's because we are naturally drawn to those things. Now, beauty standards don't necessarily give structure to society, but as I said, attractiveness stems from biology. And so I was listening to a podcast and someone said, humans, we're built to obsess over our bodies with ourselves, and in relation to others. We know certain things to be attractive or more desirable or more of a threat, that kind of thing. And we are very much aware of all of this. And if we aren't very high in, that index of attractiveness in relation to our peers, then we get depressed. And so, as I've said, some beauty trends have documented properties that are, there's an evolutionary reason why those would be attractive. Being fit in a hostile environment is a good thing, better than not being fit. Being confident suggests that, people can handle difficult things, all kinds of things. Certain hip to waist ratios suggest healthier childbearing capacity, stuff like that. So a lot of beauty trends are emergent properties, and the specifics can and will vary from place to place. And so don't mean this as saying we should just agree with all beauty standards, or it's like that's the way it is, you should just go along with it. I'm just saying a lot of people are saying beauty standards are bad. We can be the generation to get rid of those things, and we can all instead value each other on the inherent goodness of being human beings, something like that. And I am belittling it. I hope I'm not being too harsh. But what my argument is that beauty standards will emerge in some way or another. So you may be able to get rid of one that you're dealing with now, but whatever caused that and will rear its ugly head at some point. And I'm not saying beauty standards are purely biological. I do believe that people can enforce them or make them seem more relevant by just going along with them or saying, yeah, I agree with that, we should do it, that kind of thing. And but back to society tells you this, because I hear a lot of people talking about the pressure they feel from society to be this or whatever that is. Again, with the 30% of the population think that red is the best color situation, not everyone agrees on the particulars of those kind of big topics of like, this is what the ideal body image is. And just like the high school situation about how everyone can talk about how, oh, that's the thing. Everyone's, that's what that person's status is. Everyone knows that, but nobody actually believes it. A lot of people they like what they like, and they don't care what society says. And they're aware of like, oh, people say that's attractive. Yeah, I don't care. Or they say this person is the most beautiful person. Yeah, whatever. They have nice skin, but I'm not feeling it. That kind of thing. And so with particularly beauty standards, a lot of the people who advocate against like society telling them what they should be doing do already know the answer of, I don't believe that is what is most attractive, but they still feel the pressure from society, quote unquote, and they still fight against it instead of just doing what they want to do or liking what they like or not caring what this nameless society tells them that they should be doing that they're not doing. And so with cultural norms, with beauty, or with cultural norms, I've heard a lot of people going back and forth on what culture is beautiful because people there's some people that say their culture is the greatest thing ever, and some say that other cultures are more beautiful because I think it's a grass is greener on the other side, or it's I think they just lost appreciation for what they have to some extent, and or maybe they just do are attracted to something else. So they will say that some cultures are more beautiful than others. They don't necessarily say that, but they will say this culture is beautiful, and then they won't say other cultures are beautiful too, just because they don't they aren't as attracted to them. And sometimes that takes the form of like European art, whether it's like painting or the structures they built there. That's beautiful, and that's what we should be having more of in our lives. Or they'll be saying like indigenous cultures; those are beautiful because they're removed from technology and they know what is most important. Um, Spoiler: everyone all over the world has problems, so don't fall into that trap. So when looking at uh, their society or other societies and cultural norms, some things they will label as stupid like if it's something in their society that they don't like, but other ideas that could be archaic or in a certain light could be as stupid as the other ones, they label that as culture. I'm going to give an example is in America, someone said that certain seemingly basic actions are misogynistic, but that same individual also has a fondness for other less industrialized countries and say that those cultures are beautiful. But if you point out that with that culture, they have certain gender roles or standards that most would argue are more misogynistic than the ones that they were saying are in America. But when probed on that, they say that's but just part of their culture. It's beautiful. Don't judge other people's cultures, even though that they were judging their own. And so, like with society, people are attracted to certain ideas, regardless of where they are, and their justifications for them aren't necessarily the most logical. And that goes for everyone, not just people who are thinking that the grass is greener on the other side or romanticizing other cultures. So, with conventions of society, like a lot of conventions are made for fixing a particular problem. But as time goes on, that problem, no one does it anymore, but that convention is still in place and it may have other effects that are hurting people's lives. And so that convention, people will say that convention is harmful. We should get rid of it. And in that case that I just mentioned about how it's an old convention that we don't need to do anymore, yeah, it makes sense to get rid of it. But other conventions, can't, like laws about, don't murder, that kind of thing, they could have been created for a good reason and that they prevented something bad from happening. And if you don't understand the why and you just say, I am being inconvenienced by this, we should get rid of it, you may be bringing on a lot of trouble. So with conventions, whether it's, there are some, you got to ask yourself, is what this was created for still a problem? Or was the medicine more deadly than the cure in that case? And there are going to be some things with conventions, or I guess in the case of society, traditions. That's the one that people, some individuals will rebuke, and then the next moment later they will defend because reasons. Tradition, like I said, culture restricts and it gives shape at the same time. So it's very easy to point at traditions that you don't care about and aren't a part of and say that's stupid, you shouldn't do it. But don't be surprised when someone points at your traditions and say that's stupid and we shouldn't do it anymore. Okay, just a few points of clarification before I wrap this all up. I talked about attraction being tied to certain beauty standards, like a biological impetus for that. But I wanted to clarify that I don't believe that attraction is solely based off of physiological phenomena. Of course, there is personality and intelligence and various other things, and of course, like I mentioned, with attraction, to each their own, just like that with other aspects. And at the end there, I kind of started talking about conventions out of the blue, and I meant conventions kind of like rules or those, like with the neighborhood, the agreed upon structure that we subscribe to in this place, things like that. And on that note, that pretty much wraps this episode up. Thank you guys so much for listening. And now it's time for a little bit of housekeeping. Thank you. Hey, everybody. Thank you for listening. This is the first episode of season 2 going on YouTube, so thank you for joining me. This episode got a decent response when I asked people about it when I uploaded it to the podcast apps. And the whole 100 people and their favorite color, the more and more I think about that and apply it to the perception of what quote unquote society tells us, it seems to be becoming more and more clear to me. But if you disagree, please let me know, or about that or anything that I said in that, please let me know why, respectfully, please. I'm not out to hurt anybody. You may know something that I don't, and if you agree with that or anything I said, please let me know why, because you still might know something that I don't. And if you've made it this far, thank you very much. If you want to support this channel, please like, comment, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and share this channel with your friends. Thank you again for listening, and I hope you tune in for next week's episode on justice. It's one of the biggest ones I've done. Thank you again, everybody, and take care.